This episode of the My Latin Life podcast is brought to you by Language Blend, the new best way to learn Spanish. Language Blend focuses on what you actually need to live and get by abroad with daily one-on-one lessons, a dedicated texting partner. It's like living in a Spanish-speaking country without ever leaving home. Go to languageblend.com for more information. Welcome back to the My Latin Life podcast. Since 2014, My Latin Life has been your trusted guide to traveling and living in Latin America. I have a special episode for you today. My guest is Ross from Vintage Passport Collector. I found Ross on Instagram, where he has close to 85,000 followers collecting basically historic passports. He's got a TikTok account, a Facebook group, and I kind of got introduced to this world of passport collectors, people who collect sort of old passport documents. And I thought it was very cool to get Ross on the podcast. So very thankful for his time. Ross, how's it going, man?
I'm doing great. And how are you today?
Doing well, thank you. You're calling in from New Jersey?
That's correct.
Awesome. And yeah, like I said, I found out about you from Instagram. I think it just came up in my recommended Discover page. And I started looking at it, and I just thought it was super cool, kind of seeing all these kind of historic passports from all over the world. It kind of looks like you collect a little bit of everything in terms of different geographies. And I just thought it'd be cool to kind of learn more about the history of passports. And I'm sure there's going to be tons of cool nuggets on this episode.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah. So where to start? I mean, I guess give us the 60-second version of how you got into passport collecting. And I guess really like what is passport collecting and how big is this? Like how many people are into this?
Okay, let's start off with the first one. And how did I get into it? I'm in my 60s, so I'm a physician by training, and I'm a meticulous kind of a history buff. If I wasn't in medicine, I probably would have been a history teacher. So I've been always interested in that since I was a little boy. And around the late 1990s, when eBay presented itself, I joined it in the late 90s, and they were selling documents like these on eBay. I was collecting for a couple of years, and then I stopped because the payment system wasn't perfected. In other words, you could send money overseas and not get anything back because there was no guarantee. You had to worry about people being honest. So I stopped until PayPal came along, and then I started back up again around 2010 or so, when it became more secure to send money for paying for these things. But I have, several friends. You were talking about the extent of the hobby. There are two people online that actually have websites on passports. Is another few that actually sell them online. One in particular has a large selling website. These are all major collectors, the three of these fellows. And I happen to know probably the largest private holder of passports in the world, and a gentleman who works in the U.S. government who probably has the most valuable collection of passports probably held in the world. Most of these documents are usually held by a ministry in some countries that are restrictive, or they are destroyed or thrown out over the years. So survivability is a big deal, and access is a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
The extent of passport collecting, this is the third question. I would say it's growing because of people like me and my colleagues, doing articles and publicizing it. I think that it's a niche hobby, a little bit like stamp collecting, but it's a little more than that because the documents, each one is unique because it's assigned to an individual. So even the most basic passport is a one of a kind. Because it was issued to that one individual, unless they have multiple, because they may be traveling over several decades. But for the most part, people maybe have one or two passports in their life and not dozens. And that's pretty much the answer to your first three queries.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I guess for anyone listening who's maybe having a hard time picturing this, well, you can go check out the Instagram. It's vintage.passport.collector. So go check that out on Instagram. And I think what's important to note is that passports are much more uniform these days where they're all kind of the same in terms of the booklet, except the color's different for the most part. So it's not that every country kind of issues their own, literally prints their own books. There's like companies that print the books. And so one company prints the books for like 30, 50 countries, right?
That's a very interesting question. At least in modern documents, yes, there's a few companies because of the security issues and the use of chips in modern biometric passports. They're I guess maybe the United States and some larger countries have their own system, like the U.S. printing its own currency. They don't tend to import that or export that to other places, at least right now. But smaller countries, they may use a service like you're talking about that can produce a secure document for them. But yeah, it's more complicated. There's a lot of anti-counterfeiting features on modern documents. The older stuff that I tend to collect, I can get into a little bit about the history and how people counterfeited them or how they prevented from counterfeiting them in the older days before biometric chips were added to the documents.
Yeah, we can definitely get into that. And just to finish my thought on kind of helping people crystallize what we're talking about, maybe you could give some examples of like 1970s passport from like Tunisia or something, or Iraq. And it's just like all over the world. They're very old. They're all different colors. They're different sizes even. Some of them have like slips and pockets and different features that often don't even exist on modern passports, especially when you get into the older ones. And so there's really like an artistic element as well. As I look at them, where they have like very cool like writing systems and the coat of arms and all this type of stuff. So the old ones are just super cool to look at.
Yeah, that's a lot of meat there you're presenting in that question. I'm going to try to unpack it a little bit. Uh, let's go back in time and talk about how the first documents were produced.
Yes.
The first ones, and there's a colleague of mine in Thailand who has a website and actually has written. There are a couple of people who've written some books, and he's one of them. And according to his book, it was Genghis Khan back in that time that would give a metal token to one of his diplomats to use as a passport, which basically said on it, "Let him pass or die." All right. So that means that the Khan's emissary, if they interfered with him, they would face very severe consequences. That's actually the first passports that were kind of utilized, maybe in ancient China and Mongolia. Okay.
Hmm.
When you get a little bit later, let's go into Europe in the, let's say, 1400s, 1500s, 1600s. Only nobility or the couriers of royalty were allowed to travel. People were sort of restricted to their towns that they were from, and they were literally like internal passports, or to use a German term, a Wanderbuch, where a salesman traveling from town to town
Hmm.
would carry this, and it would be stamped by the authorities as he would enter the town. This is kind of how it started. People really didn't travel across the ocean. People didn't travel across Europe or Asia. That was rare. So the early documents that you see are really issued as single sheet. They were like maybe 15 by 20 inches using US standards on a high quality paper with a wax seal
Yeah,
and
raised seal.
signature
Yeah.
on it. Yeah, that were those were the ones issued in like the 1400s, 1500s, handwritten, allowing someone to, doing the business of whatever the nobility or the government to travel and conduct trade. That were the early ones. They started to become more standardized as single sheet items in the 19th century.
And hey, before we get to the 19th century, I'd love like a little bit more context on historic stuff. Like in the Islamic world, they'd be like, this person has been to Mecca. Here's like their Islamic rite of movement, stuff like that.
That's a Hajj passport. Now, that's a separate issue, right? Because in Islam, one is supposed to attend the Hajj once in their lifetime.
Hmm.
So they made specific transit documents for people to attend the Hajj. That's a whole nother subject. But yeah, or pilgrimage, that's
Yeah.
one type of pilgrimage. Now, I'm looking for on my to do list, if I could find one, and people can look this up if they want to afterwards, is a Vimy pilgrimage passport and the U.S. equivalent. And you're going to say, what is that? I know you got me into this thought, so I'm going to finish it. A Vimy pilgrimage passport was issued by the Canadian government in the 1930s, like 1937, I believe, 20 years after the Battle of Vimy Ridge, where a lot of Canadian soldiers died in France, in Flanders.
Yeah, we call it Vimy.
Vimy. And I actually have the Vimy medal, meaning the commemorative medal given to the people who went to visit their sons or their husbands at the burial grounds in Vimy. And the Canadians issued Vimy passports for the pilgrimage and paid for the trip. And I'm actually looking for one of those. That's one on my to-do list if I could find it. Another was similar was the Americans did that as well in the 1930s, but they didn't call it a Vimy passport. It was a pilgrimage passport, though, and they're quite rare. You don't see them very often. And I'll just stop with that thought. So
I imagine like even before you get to the 19th century booklets, that probably in like the city states of Venice and like ancient Greece, they must have had something, some sort of document.
You're a good point about Venice, but ancient Greece is sort of like going back to the Mongols. They didn't have much in terms of what survived to really know what they did, but with emissaries, But in terms of, let's say, ancient Europe, it was more like the nobility traveling and people doing business or merchants for the elite classes of Europe at that time. It wasn't ordinary people. Mm-hmm. And they used, like I said, single sheet documents in those days. When I was alluding to earlier in the 19th century, they still used single sheet documents, but some of the well-to-do people would go to a leather merchant, and the leather merchant would glue the passport folded, sort of like 4x6-inch folds, into a leather wallet, and they have the person's name on it. In fact, I posted one recently on the Instagram channel if people want to look at one. And you'd open it up, and the passport would open, and there would be some extra pages, almost like you had a notepad on the one side of the leather wallet, where wherever they traveled, the entry and exit stamps could be stamped on those pages and not soil the passport. It's very interesting. The British had those, and the Americans had those, as far as I know. I'm not sure about other European countries. I really haven't seen examples of some, let's say, from the German Empire or France using those booklets. Only the British and the Americans did that. You're looking, let's say, with the establishment of the United States in the 1790s after the Constitution was written. And if you're a collector of things during that time, the French Revolution was going on. And believe it or not, the older passports that you can collect that are fairly easy to find are ones related to the French Revolution. You can find them on eBay for like $60. And so you can get a cheap example of something that's 200 years old that has historical importance. I personally like, as an aside, French passports from the 19th century. I like because the government's changing. The French went through several republics and royal governments and empire governments, meaning by an authoritarian figure like Napoleon, between 1801 and, let's say, 1870. And I found examples of each of these. So they'd go from like Napoleon to a king, and then to a republic, and back to a king, and then to an emperor. It was really interesting when you look at these, if you were to take a serial picture of the different documents related to these governments. And I find that fascinating. I also try to collect the money that was around at that time, like the silver coinage that was associated with the documents they would use during that travel.
Mm-hmm. Was there times where you'd get both? Like you'd get a coin and a piece of paper and they'd kind of correspond to each other?
Oh, yeah, all the time. I'm on a side note, I'm also kind of a coin collector, a numismatic person. And I go to coin shows twice a month, and I try to look for coins that would match my documents when I present them. So, for instance, I did a presentation of a Ukrainian People's Republic, which a comment on it was that that's fake. And I said, no, sir, it's not fake. When the Bolshevik Revolution occurred in 1917-18, Some of the former parts of the Russian Empire wanted to become independent, like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Finland. Finland was part of the Russian Empire before 1917. And Poland and Romania, these were all incorporated. So they all became independent states. And some of the documents related to these, including the Ukraine, only were there for the briefest time. The Ukrainian People's Republic only existed between 1918 and 1921, and it wasn't a consistent government. But what's most interesting is they issued passports after the demise of the republic. In other words, people kind of used them. The money existed, the hryvnia, and the passport existed. But where I found most of my examples of UKR passports, Ukrainian People's Republic, were post demise of the republic, issued in Berlin or issued in Paris or Antwerp to former Ukrainian citizens seeking an ID that they could use to emigrate. That's where I found them. So I found like 4 of these, and I posted a couple on my channel if people are interested in looking at them. And I found some of the money that's associated with those documents. But that's just one example. You were alluding earlier to different passport sizes and types, right? Mm-hmm. In the 19th century, most of them were single sheet documents without a photograph. That's important that I tell you that, because the photographs only became standardized on passports in 1914. So after 1914, there must have been a convention that was held where most countries started adding photographs to their documents. Now, by the early part of the 19th century, there weren't too many booklets still. They were using single sheet documents. They started to convert to booklets around 1910, slowly. Some countries would adopt the booklet, and then some would still have a single sheet. But by the early 1920s, most of the single sheet documents disappeared, and they were all booklet form. The United States, for example, in 1919, they used single sheet passports up to 1919. They added photographs after 1914. But what they would do is they would they'd put like a little flange on the paper passport, part of the passport, put a flange glued on it, and then glue that to a cardboard folder where you could actually fold the passport in a 5x8 form or 5x7 form, and then open it up like a booklet, and then the single sheet would fold out and you could turn the pages. That was kind of a transitional passport. And then they became really full booklet form after that. Because of World War I, essentially, there were a lot of displaced people and people moving around, and they needed identity documents. It was really a fictation of World War I, because before World War I, you had the Habsburg Empire of Austria-Hungary, which now comprises several different countries besides Hungary. If you look at a map, you had the German Empire, you had France, you had Great Britain. Those were the great powers. But, people after World War I were displaced, and they needed some type of identity document. So the people who were, say, part of Austria-Hungary, who lived in what became Yugoslavia, or the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, as it was referred to after 1919, they needed identity documents. And so they created them. Poland created them. The new Hungarian state created them. So it was a matter of necessity. And before I forget, let me add this. Think about all your listeners. What happened to all the white Russians? And I don't mean that in terms of Caucasian color of your skin. There were the Reds, the Bolsheviks, and there were the whites. Those were the bourgeois people who did not follow Stalin, Lenin, and
They were like the
Bolshevik
royalists,
Revolution.
I guess, the monarchists.
So what happened was that after 1920, the Soviet government started to make those people stateless. In other words, they had no transit documents to move around. They weren't Russian citizens anymore. They were stateless people. Now, this is a very interesting story. So what happened to them? How did they solve that problem? Well, the League of Nations was created after World War I. It was a big project of Woodrow Wilson. And he thought that would end all wars and everybody would communicate better through the League of Nations. And there was a Norwegian explorer named Fredrik Nansen. You could look him up. The people can look him up. And Nansen came out with a protocol to help solve this refugee problem. And his solution was to make what they called a Nansen travel document for a stateless person so they could get from point A to their final destination. And most of the Nansen documents that I have that are before 1935, let's say, are Russian refugees. And they were used to go to either Great Britain, the United States, France, anywhere but Russia. And I could go into that story a little bit more, but I'm just talking about the document that was used to travel from point A to point B was a Nansen travel document or a travel passport. And they did that, for a good purpose, and it actually solved a problem with regards to immigration.
Interesting. Do you know how to spell the name? I'm trying to Google it.
Yeah, Friedrich Nansen would be Nansen.
Nansen travel document. Okay.
Yeah. And you may see examples. If you look at images, they'll show them to you.
Nansen
And
passport. I had heard of this. I had heard of this.
I have about a dozen Nansen travel documents in my collection. They can be quite pricey.
Yeah, very cool. Internationally recognized 1922 to 1938. Cool. So World War I kind of created the need. It's kind of interesting because now every country in the world obviously has a passport, but you had this situation, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, whatever, where part of the world had passports and part of the world didn't. How did that kind of work?
Well, I think every country had a travel document. It was whether you had access to it or not. That's the point. So, in other words, I'll give you an example, right? Let's look at Africa. Africa was colonized, right, by mostly the French and the British. They divided Africa up. Mm-hmm. And there was some Portuguese presence, and there was some little bit of Spanish presence and a little bit of German presence, but it was mainly France and Great Britain. All those countries had colonial passports, all of them. And you could travel on them. They're very rare. They're expensive if you find them on the market for sale, especially the British ones. One of my friends who actually has the website I alluded to that sells documents, he probably has the largest collection of British colonial passports in the world. I went to his home in Romania. It's literally like 14 binders filled with British colonial passports. Really rare ones. You're talking about like the Solomon Islands colony they had, Sarawak, Tanganyika, Zanzibar, Gold Coast. These are all colonies of Great Britain, right? And citizens had access to them, but it was limited because those countries were poorer, right? You go to a country like Congo, which was a Belgian colony. Mm-hmm. The Congolese people were treated very badly by the Belgians. Mm-hmm. And in 1960, people will know about Patrice Lumumba becoming the first president of independent Congo, but he wasn't received very well. So, people go in and try to undermine his government by creating a breakaway government like you see in Sudan with Northern Sudan and Southern Sudan. Well, in Congo, it was Katanga province. And one of Lumumba's opposition leaders, Moses Shamba, I'm maybe not pronouncing that right, Shambe, created a puppet government in Katanga that issued its own currency and passport. Mm-hmm. It's very rare to see a Katanga passport. So I think I seen an example in 20 years for sale on eBay. It went for $3,500. Good discussion piece, right? Another one that's rare is you've heard that like the Vatican issues its own travel documents. I actually have a Vatican diplomatic passport from the 1930s. Very rare. That's cool. All right. But there's a little order called the Sovereign Order of Malta. Now, some of your listeners may have heard.
I was just in Malta a couple of weeks ago, by the way.
Right. The Sovereign Order of Malta is an offshoot of the Vatican.
Yes, and they only Templar. Yeah.
Correct. The symbol of the Knights Templar is on their passport. It's a very, very rare passport. Mm-hmm. I've seen one where all the pages were ripped out except one, and the covers are intact. It sold for $400. Can you believe it? The one that was intact from 1966 with the slip cover went for $3,500 on eBay.
And actually, I read recently that it's still an active passport and only like three people have it. And
Yes,
it's recognized in like
yes,
100 countries.
yes, that's true. That's why it's so rare. There's more than three. There's three official ones, but there's some unofficial ones. I have what do you call it, an honorary ID for a member of the Knights of Malta.
Hmm.
It's from like 1967 or something like that. It's not a passport, but it's an ID for someone in the order.
Hmm. Because they're like an observer of the UN or something like that still. It's weird. It's a very
Correct.
interesting situation, but yeah.
Correct.
That's cool. What so many? I feel like I don't even need to ask questions. I can just let you talk for like 2 hours about different like nerdy rare things, and like it'll be a better episode.
Well, I can get into some things, but I can go off on a tangent. But I think I answered some of your questions with things being established. But let me tell you a few other things. Is that you talked earlier about different color on the passport covers.
Yes.
I wanted to get back to that so your listeners could understand that. Those are usually for different types of travel documents. I'll give you an example. A diplomatic passport has a different color than a normal passport. Let's say an American passport is blue.
Hmm.
The diplomatic is black.
Hmm.
Okay. Service passport is different. A special passport is different. These are all different types. And they all had different colors to their cover. Let's say you were a non-citizen of a country and you wanted to work there, right? You get a work permit, you would think, but they had passport types that were used for non-citizens, and they had a different color. They
There
get
was like a
really
green card passport.
not a green card. It's like I'm thinking it's. I have to give you an example. It's
Yeah, I've seen the
let's
diplomatic one though. Yeah.
not a diplomatic. I'm talking about like non-citizens.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Let's look at Germany after World War II. That's a really interesting example. And I collect a lot of German passports going back to. I have a passport signed by Bismarck from the 1870s or 80s. I've got a lot of interesting German passports, not just the Third Reich stuff, which I find interesting, and that's a whole nother story I can get in a little bit. But post-war Germany, let's look at that. So it was divided up into four sections by the Allied powers and the Soviets, right? You had the British zone, the American zone, the French zone in the West, and the Russian zone, right? And then they started to establish after 1948 East and West Germany, all right? Now, before 1951, if you were a German and you needed to travel somewhere, you needed a special travel permit, okay? And it was usually for a citizen, it was green, and for a refugee, it was red. The refugee ones are much rarer, by the way. And you needed to get a visa to exit from the Allied high military government with a certain revenue stamp that was canceled on that, and then the visa to the country or destination you were going. So that's just one example. All right. After 1951, West Germany issued its own passports. And after 1955, East Germany issued its own passports. And I have several examples of each, the rarest being for me a East German diplomatic passport I have from 1977 that was used to go to Soviet occupied Afghanistan. I actually have it pinned on my Instagram page if people want to look at it. And it's got a visa from the Soviet puppet government in Afghanistan in 1978. It's one of my favorite passports because of that. So, yeah, there were different colored passports to reflect different purposes, right? I also have passports of people who were, let's say, on government business, meaning they were probably working for one of the alphabet agencies, think James Bond kind
Yeah,
of
yeah,
stuff.
yeah,
All right.
yeah,
And I actually have a very well documented American OSS agent who later became CIA. I found her passport on eBay and I bought it. It's posted on the Instagram page. Her name was Elizabeth McIntosh. That was her pseudonym, but her real name was Elizabeth Hepner. and she was an expert in Japanese language. So she was recruited by the OSS in 1942 to listen to Japanese broadcasts or military broadcasts to translate. After the war, she became a CIA operative posted in the Far East, and I have her passport. She lived to be 103 years old, by the way. She died in 2015.
Damn,
Very
you should have
interesting.
like given it to her on her, like, like in the hospital or something.
Right. Well, I mean, I have people who I suspect were working for the government doing certain things in many instances. One example of which is a red official passport from the US from 1963, right around the time that Kennedy was assassinated, of a guy who, I mean, if you look at the picture in the document, this is also posted on the IG page. Um, he has like a, what do they call it? High and tight military haircut. The guy's probably in his 40s, early 50s, so he's probably ex military. He's only landing in military bases when he's traveling, and he's going to South Vietnam between 1963 and 65. God knows what he was doing there, but he was there at the time when President Diem was assassinated in November of 1963, 3 weeks before Kennedy died. So I have a suspicion that that guy was involved in some interesting stuff. Let's put it that way. Another document that I'm highly suspicious of is a 2 document set I have of a Polish national. His name was Banaszak, but I'm not sure if that was his real name. You know what it lists his job as? Cosmetologist. So he's listed as a cosmetologist, yet he's traveling all over the world and the Far East. Very suspicious. And he's in Hawaii during the war, and he's issued an American passport in Hawaii, and he was traveling all over the place as a cosmetologist. He was not a cosmetologist, he was something else. But that's just one of the types of interesting documents I have in my collection.
Hey guys, quick break from the episode to tell you about BitRefill. BitRefill allows you to shop online and in person without banks, converting your crypto directly into merchant balance. We're talking gift cards to Nike, Amazon, Apple, Airbnb, Hotels.com, and many more, all paid for with crypto. BitRefill offers more than 10,000 gift card options in 180 countries, including the USA, Canada, all across Latin America, including Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Argentina, El Salvador, and many more. You can also apply the code MyLatinLife at checkout to get 10% back on your first purchase. Go to bitrefill.com for more information. Yeah, what are some other interesting ones?
I've got an American emergency passport issued in Berlin in 1914, single page, signed by he wasn't the ambassador, but I think his name is James Grew. I might get his first name wrong, but Grew is Grew. If you look it up, Ambassador Grew. He was the ambassador to Tokyo at the time of the Pearl Harbor attacks for the United States. And I happened to find him. He must have been like the second secretary. It might have been young in his career as a diplomat. And he was probably the second secretary in the Berlin embassy, and he was signing passports at the time. And I happen to have this one that's signed by Grew. I have one signed by Secretary of State Seward. On American stuff, I like some of the signatures of the Secretary of States. So I have Secretary of State Stewart under Lincoln and under Johnson, who bought Alaska from the Russians, signed on a couple of 1860s U.S. passports. I have signed passports, not by a facsimile, but by fountain pen signature of Secretary of State Henry Stimson, Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Secretary of State George Marshall. I have them all original signature passports, but they're usually on diplomatic passports. They only sign the diplomatic ones. The ordinary ones had a facsimile signature on them.
Yeah. And there's so many threads. I want to ask you about your specific collection and what you collect and what you look for. But this is also a good time to ask about the legality of owning
Okay.
passports of different people. And it doesn't sound like you even have to wait till they're dead. I don't know. Like, can you walk through the legality stuff?
Well, I'll do that. That's really a great question. It's not illegal to own a canceled obsolete passport, because that's the government signing off that it's not used anymore. In other words, there's different ways to make a passport obsolete. One is that it simply expires. It's laying in a drawer. Okay. The second way is to have it clip canceled. In other words, they take a scissor and clip off the bottom or top quarter at the corners of the front page of the
I
document or
saw
first
that.
few
So
pages
that
of the
means
document.
it's canceled if it's clipped at the top and the bottom.
That's called clip canceled.
Okay.
Right. Another way of canceling a passport is going through it the old-fashioned way with a red or black stamp that says invalid in whatever language you choose. Another way is to punch cancel it. Take a big hole punch and punch a couple of holes in the document. Like the Dutch would punch a hole in the center of the document. Other countries would punch a couple of indescript holes in the front of the document through and through. Other countries would take like a special cancellation device that would spell out the word cancel in little holes and put the passport through that little punch, and it would just come out with like a braille form of canceled on there, right? So there's many ways that you can cancel a passport. Once they're canceled, the government, it depends on the government, can either let you hold your own passport and do what you want with it. You could throw it in the garbage. You could sell it online if you want. It's not valid anymore. It's your own personal property, and because the government doesn't necessarily own it anymore because they canceled it. All right. Mm-hmm. Now, where it gets a little dicey is I get some emails, at least a half a dozen in the last year. That was my grandfather's passport. That was my aunt's passport. That was can I have this? And my answer for that is yes, you can when I'm dead. All right. So I'm in my 60s now. If it's your aunt's passport and you can prove that it's your aunt or your uncle's passport, you send me your contact information and I'll put it in my will that your family will get that document upon my passing. That's fair enough, because otherwise I'd be selling and giving away a lot of these things, and I don't want to do that, because if they really wanted the document, they would have taken the care to actually taking the possession of the relatives' personal items and look through them. A lot of families don't do that. So let's say someone goes into a yard sale or a house clean out, and these people will pick out interesting items and sell them on eBay. So if the family was so interested, they should have taken it in their possession when the relative died and actually held on to it. So I don't necessarily buy into that. I know it sounds kind of harsh, but, I don't know if that person is not telling me the truth and will turn around and flip the document for a lot of money. And I won't give it to them. I did that one time when I was starting to post on TikTok. An Indian family came out to me and they said, that's our uncle's passport. He went and worked in East Africa. I go, can we have this? I go, okay, let me see if I can find a replacement, because British India passports are pretty rare, especially ones that travel to Africa. So I ended up finding a replacement. When I went back to give them the passport, no one answered me. So I stopped doing that. So now my answer is, you want the document, you send me your personal information, I make a list of people. When I'm no longer of this earth, it's all yours. I won't need it anymore. All right?
Damn, you can get it in 30 years, bro.
Yep. Well, I don't know if I'm going to last that long, but put it this way, a lot of the stuff that I have on an alternate subject, I'm probably going to donate to a museum.
For sure. You get a whole wing. You get a whole wing at the New Jersey Museum.
Well, not people really are interested in the thing that people are more interested in. I'm going to divert a little bit here. Is a lot of World War II stuff. All right. And what I mean by that, there's so much nuance with World War II. I have a collecting friend who has a website, and he collects the perpetrators on the German side and the Japanese side in World War II. So he looks for the war criminals, and he has quite a few.
You get some Brazilian ones.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but I can tell you that I have really only one war criminal in my, maybe two. The people that weren't really put in jail. in my collection. One is a guy who was an Austrian national who had family in Yugoslavia and Bosnia, and the German SS sent him into Bosnia during the war and had him start the one of the SS units there. And he was on the execution list, if you want to use that for a lesser term, after the war by the Czechs and the Yugoslavs. And he escaped into Austria and he wasn't extradited and lived out the rest of his life.
Mhm.
That's my example of one war criminals.
And
Doc.
Ross, if I could, to be honest, personally, I'm not that interested in World War II stuff,
All right.
nor kind of war related documents.
All right.
Um, yeah, so I would kind of rather avoid that for a couple of reasons. So speaking of avoidance, we were talking offline about how there are certain documents that you look to avoid, and then on the flip side, there's certain types of documents that you look for. Could you kind of walk us through maybe what types of documents you avoid, either because they're not rare or because of whatever, and then after that, maybe on the flip side, like what you look for, what's interesting, what's rare.
I look for documents that are unique, have a lot of extensive travel, which your listeners might enjoy. In other words, I look for documents that say have accordion like extensions or extra pages attached. All right. Now, uh, the one thing an example of that is a 1948 to 1949 U.S. diplomatic courier's passport I have. It's literally an inch and a half thick. Think of an American passport. It's not usually that thick, right? There's so many extensions and pages added that it opens up like an Indiana Jones looking for the Holy Grail type book. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
So I collect things like that. So I found, like, for instance, a set of documents in the past year that was used by an oil geologist for Aramco, the Arab American oil company that was used in the Middle East from like 1958 to 1970. He had three passports completely filled with visas and extensions. If you put them on top of each other, it's probably about 2 inches thick. That stuff I really like. If I
Yeah,
find it, I
that
buy it.
actually surprises me. I mean, that one sounds pretty cool, but so you're actually talking about a passport that otherwise would not be that rare, just like a normal whatever 1950 passport,
Right?
but it's rare because it has so many stamps in it.
It's rare because it's so extensively traveled, right? Meaning it's just you have to like literally spend a few hours to decipher when this guy went from place A to place B to place C. It's really hard because a lot of times the passport agents, when you go to an airport, they just look for an empty space and stamp it, right? So they don't do it necessarily in a chronological order. So you have to go back and forth and and try to figure out where this guy went on his trips. It's
Mm.
almost impossible to decipher it all. If you were sitting next to me and looking at these documents during this interview, you would be amazed how you could decipher all that out.
Yeah. Yeah, we've actually had a couple of podcast guests that are chasing 193 countries who are looking to go to every country in the world, and they talk about, how hard it was to get the visa for Algeria or Saudi or
Oh
whatever.
yeah. But you know something? A lot of countries nowadays they issue Schengen visas. Let's say in Europe, you don't get stamps anymore crossing borders in Europe and the European Union. So a lot of those old-fashioned entry and exit stamps, they're done by the wayside now. No
Mm.
more. I think the future of passports won't be a document you carry. I hate to say this. I think it's going to go to a card with a chip in it. And
Hmm.
then after that, I think we're going to get chipped, but maybe not during my lifetime. But that's what I think where it's going to go. And that's how they'll know who you are and where your movements are and so on and so forth. It's kind of Orwellian, but I kind of think that it's going to go in that direction, that paper documents are going to be going by the wayside in the next 50
Yeah,
years.
sure. Yeah, I feel like this is out of order in the conversation, but I actually did want to get to this because as such a someone with so much context on the history of passports, you have a good context on how we go from the past to the future. And I see this a lot as well. A lot of countries have stopped issuing stamps and they just basically enter the information in the computer. And then, like with residency cards, where it's not a passport, but let's say, like for example, I'm a resident of Mexico, but I'm not a citizen. I have a card for Mexico, a resident card, and it has a barcode on the back. And when I enter and exit, they scan the barcode, so I don't get stamps in Mexico anymore. And
Right.
yeah,
I
there's
think you're going to see more of that. I think as things start to consolidate over the next 20 years, if we don't blow ourselves up in war with all this nonsense you see going on around us, that even the United States may make a confederation with Canada and Mexico. I actually think that's the way to go. I think that the U.S. should make like a loose confederation like the European
the
Union,
NAFTA, yeah,
not just NAFTA, where you actually
North American Union. Yeah, they've been like kind of
elect.
they've been conspiracy theorying about that for a while, like on YouTube.
Yeah, I think that that would be a good thing actually to have a North, because when you think about it, the U.S. has to rely on an international supply chain, let's say to get all your medications and basic things that they don't necessarily manufacture here. Well, Mexico can play a role in that. You can uplift Mexico's standard of living by doing a lot of manufacturing there. All right. And then you can just do a lot of, I guess, growing of food and mining or whatever things are light manufacturing or specialty manufacturing in the US and Canada. And it's basically self sufficient. You have all your oil and gas between those three countries, even though people are saying the global warming and they want to switch over to, greener energy. I don't see that happening. I don't want to divert off passports anytime soon, only because India and China are among the world's biggest polluters with coal fired plants, and they're not going away right away. And I think it was a mistake for the Europeans to close their nuclear plants, especially in
For
Germany.
sure. We're definitely going off track. Um,
Yeah.
I guess just in terms of passports not getting stamped anymore, do you want to kind of complete that thought? Because yeah, I mean, even people who are chasing 193, they have to go through multiple passports to get there, and they kind of have to keep getting it issued. I mean, that's pretty standard. But yeah, now countries aren't even giving stamps anymore, and I don't even like overly get what they do. They just punch in your name and birth date and like let you through.
That's right. They're not even stamping the passport. So the time to get stamps was really the 1970s. If you went in the 1970s to every country, and that was possible, um, that would have been very interesting passport to see because they stamped everything back then.
Yeah, that was
You
like
would
the
have
way, because it's like such a low tech way to do it, because people are so concerned about, oh, you only get 90 days per tourist visa, blah blah blah, and they want to make sure that you haven't overstayed, and a stamp is just not really the most effective way to do that.
well, I was mentioning earlier, like think about in the 1970s, let's say traveling, let's go to like, let's pick a year like 1972, all right? And you were traveling through Asia Minor, which you could still do. People traveled to Afghanistan to see the sights when it was not a Taliban government, right? Or a Russian government. Well, but you could have gotten a travel stamp through there. You could have gone to all the small countries in Africa. I guess the unsafe countries in those days would have probably been. I mean, it was always hard to get into Nauru and Nepal, right?
Hmm.
They didn't want people to go there, so they gave out very few visas. So those are the ones on people's to-do list that they have the hardest time getting to. Isn't that correct?
Right.
So to get stamps from them, you can find a Nauru passport for sale. My rarest are the small countries, like where you don't have a lot of citizens. Like
Hmm.
I've got Tonga. All right, that's rare. Um, Try to find Liechtenstein. I do have one. Try to find San Marino. I
Yeah,
do
San
have
Marino.
one.
Do you?
Right, I do.
Yeah.
Try to find now. We're going
Palau.
back. Yeah, I don't have Andorra, and I don't have Monaco. I have a travel permit from 1895 to visit Monaco, and I have a British, that's an interesting card, by the way, and I have a British passport from 1939 used through 1943 for a wealthy British noblewoman who was living in Monaco during the war. So the passport is renewed by the Swiss because at the time the British couldn't. Monaco's a little tiny country on the French Riviera, right? So I guess it was part of Vichy France or German occupied France later on. And how are you going to get the document renewed? That's a whole nother topic. Let's see. You talk about countries. This is another topic of passports and visas. Is what if two countries aren't getting along with each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who's going to provide the visa services? Doesn't that make sense? I'll give you an example. Let's look at Vietnam and Cambodia in 1969. Now, I have Vietnam passports where they traveled to Cambodia, but they weren't talking to one another for some reason. So the Japanese were providing visas for a Vietnamese person to travel to Cambodia in 1969. Another example is the Six-Day War in the Middle East. Nasser broke off relations, with several countries, and it was hard to get Egyptian visas. It was actually worse in '56 during the Suez Crisis, because let's say I have an Egyptian passport for a pianist from 1955 to '59. Okay. And the guy was traveling through Europe. Well, Egypt wasn't having relations with France and Great Britain at that time. So who's doing the visa services? Who's renewing this Egyptian passport every year? It was India, right? So you get the idea. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1920, there was no ready diplomatic relations with Turkey. So the Swiss were handling Turkish visa interests in the United States and other countries after World War I. It's a common theme. The Swiss did a lot of it. Other countries also participated, but the majority were the Swiss because they remained neutral with everybody.
Mm-hmm. Random question on stamps, like, can a stamp make a passport more valuable? Because I imagine the stamps kind of change over time.
Oh, yes.
And
Yes.
like maybe whatever XYZ country only issued this type of stamp this year, and then if you have that passport, it makes that
Oh,
passport
yeah.
more rare.
You're hitting the nail on the head with some rare stamps, like let's say going to the Holy See on a diplomatic mission. A diplomatic's visa for the Holy See is not often to see. Not often you're going to find one. A stamp to Afghanistan, as we talked about, rare, right? Like I just bought a passport, right, from a friend of mine in Croatia, because I have a friend who's a dealer in Croatia, and he found me a German passport that was actually the person went to the United States during World War II and stayed there, but the passport had to be renewed. So who renewed it? The Swiss. Interesting, right? And that was in 1943. Or I have an Italian passport from World War II of a woman who married an American, and she emigrated to the States. She got out of Europe through Spain and Portugal. Very interesting route of escape, by the way. Got to the United States. It's an Italian passport. They had no relations. The Swiss renewed it, right? All this stuff, like where the countries aren't talking to one another, those are rare stamps. And if you see them, I'm very much attracted to those type of documents.
Yeah. I mean, it's like I feel like there's just endless red meat for passport collectors where it's just like Spanish colonial document from Bolivia, blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? It's like, it's literally endless. You should be like Dutch colonial
Right.
Curacao.
Well, put it this way. You're talking about, like, let's talk about, like, since you're Latin, and I'm assuming you have Mexican heritage,
I'm
right?
not actually. I may or may not be Canadian American,
All
but
right.
we
Well,
live in Latin America because
all
we like it.
right. So you have Latin audience. So let's talk about some Latin related.
No, and sorry to clarify. I told you this offline. The audience is largely Canadian American, European, but
Ah, okay, okay.
they enjoy like living as expats in Latin America, like
Ah,
the
okay.
same
I
way.
understand.
Like you're from New Jersey, but maybe you
Right.
spend your winters in Costa Rica, that kind of thing.
Right. Okay. I understand. Let's look at Canada. All right. Canada was a dominion. All right. And I have a very dear friend who's an Iranian Canadian. All right. And I can't tell you, I don't know where he found these documents. I'm not going to really delve into it. But let's just say after the Shah fell from power in 1979 and the new government took over, they probably would have burned these passports because they had wanted nothing to do with the Shah's government. And somebody in the foreign ministry, I believe, rescued these before they were destroyed and got them out of Iran. And they include former prime minister passports. And I've actually traded him for a few of these. He traded them to me because he likes 18th and 19th century documents. And I had a couple that he really liked. One I had that I traded him that he really liked was an early Dominion of Canada passport from 1906. It was cool. A single sheet document. And he really wanted that, so I traded it to him. He gave me a few of these Iranian diplomatic passports from the 1940s, 30s. They're really fascinating. And I posted them on the IG page so people can look at them. I actually posted the Dominion of Canada 1906 before I traded it to him. Mm-hmm. So I think I have about 500 documents posted. So a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about on this show are posted on the IG site. So any of the listeners, you're really going to have to spend a little time to deep dive into those. And it may be hard to locate for some people who are not familiar with documents because some of the covers are very nondescript, and you'd have to look at the video to see what country it is. In the beginning, when I was posting, I didn't put a label on it. In the last couple of months, I added labels to all the documents so people know what it is when the video starts. But yeah, I mean, Canadian stuff. I have actually a Supreme Court justice from Mexico's passport from 1950. It's one of my favorites. Guys, the Supreme Court, it's like owning, I don't know, one of the justices of the United States Supreme Court passport.
Yeah.
Just have a Mexican one.
You know what I like is when the passport cover says something different than the traditional cover. Like the traditional cover just says like passport, United States of America or whatever. But the cool ones I feel are like when it says diplomatic or it says something else that's like not typical.
Right. Oh yeah. Those are, you know what's another interesting one? I call them like Frankenstein passports. And I use that term loosely. It's a passport that, let's say a country that once existed stopped existing.
Yes. I was going to get to this too.
Yeah. And what they did is they glued the country that isn't around anymore to a newer document. And there's a couple of different examples of that I could go into, but I have a few of those.
Yeah, country. Do you have like Prussia?
Yeah, well, not Prussia, but like Danzig, the Free State of Danzig, which actually only existed from 1919 to 1939, and the city-state of Memel. These were all established in the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. And they had passports for them. So I actually have a Memel passport, extremely rare.
I've never even heard of that.
I have a passport.
Klaipeda region? Hmm? What the heck? That's cool. Sorry, keep going.
Yeah, Memel is on the Clapadian Peninsula. So if you want to look where that is, it's sort of near Lithuania, an old Prussia area, where the Russians have an enclave right now in Kaliningrad, which was also known as Königsberg when the Germans controlled it. So Memel and Danzig are in that area of the world.
Do you have passports from these places?
Of course, and they're on the IG page. In fact, I have all 4 types of Danzig passport, and they're all on there. There were 4 different types.
You ever just like approach like maybe like the richest guy from like from Poland or whatever, and just be like, yo, I got the set, and they'd probably pay big money for them?
Well, that it's not really that. It's not like it's a very niche hobby, right? I'm gonna tell you what, like I go to auctions when I want something. All right. Now I know you don't want to talk about World War II, but I'm gonna divulge something. So I'm Jewish, okay, and I collect Red J or escape passports from World War II. All right. That Jews that were under duress, how did they get out of Europe? Okay. Mm-hmm. And I collect those documents. So for me, I find that very interesting. So there was an auction this past week in Israel, and I won a lot. I'm not going to tell you what I paid for it, but it was four figures of three different Red J passports. It was a family. The family was getting out of Austria in 1940, very late, after the Anschluss. So the Anschluss occurred, Austria was absorbed into Germany, and these people had to get out. So they get to Belgium. And in Belgium, the son, who was traveling on a canceled Austrian passport, was given a German one. And they emigrated out of the country, I think, to either Great Britain or the United States or Canada. I have to look up. It's actually sitting in my mailbox today. It was mailed to me. I got it today. I haven't gone home to check my mail. Anyway, all the documents related to this family, including all the passports, I bought in an auction. And it was four figures. So these things are not cheap. And the thing that caused me to buy this particular set was that the Germans did not put a red J, which stands for Jude, on the inside cover of other passports other than German ones by their law in 1939. There was a law in 3839 that they added the red J to the German passport to identify you. They also added, let's say, your middle name. If you were a male, you'd be called Israel. So if you were Tom Brown, you'd be Tom Israel Brown. If you were a woman, you'd be like Rachel Sarah Brown, right? They'd add it to your name to identify you. So they didn't tend to do this on non-German documents. So here is an Austrian passport from 1938 that had a red J applied to it. Very, very rare. I've only seen a few examples in 20 years. So I took the opportunity to bid on that in the auction because I don't have one in my collection and I wanted to get one. That's just a story of how I purchased some things and related to selling and buying. It's a very niche hobby. Yeah. Somebody really has to have an interest in that particular document in order to what they want to spend on it.
I really should have asked this at the very beginning of the episode, but how many passports and travel documents do you have currently?
Probably 1,000.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, but I have, the person that I was telling you about earlier, he's in his early 80s. He was
Romanian.
He's from Europe. He's from Belgium. He's in the Guinness Book of World Records as having them. I think they have it's in that book, believe it or not, that he owns the most different passports in all the world. He has over 3,500 documents. So I don't know where he puts them, and he's been selling them a little bit at a time on some auction sites because he's 80-something years old now, or 79, 80 years old. There was a collecting friend I had in Poland who passed away last year. He was 82. He was a member of the old communist government in Poland as part of their interior ministry, and that's how he got interested in passports. So he had some very rare Polish passports I think he left to his family to dispose of. But he was 82. So on an aside note, it's not a younger person's hobby, but I think my page is getting younger people interested. And like, if you go to a stamp show nowadays, I'm like the youngest guy there. I'm in my early 60s, right?
Dude, I know I used to do collect numismatic coins a fair bit, like U.S. silver dollars and stuff. I remember this one time, this is totally random, but I had especially there was like a big like gold and silver hype cycle in around maybe 2014 or something. And
right.
We really got into collecting gold and silver coins and back then. And we went and in my city there was like a numismatic event, and we trekked across town. I think we probably bicycled there. We trekked across town. We show up this numismatic event. Me and one of my buddies. We open up the front door, and everybody had gray hair. It was just all like 70-year-old gray men, and we were legit pretty young, and we were kind of just embarrassed, I guess. We were just kind of like, oh, I guess the wrong place, and we just dipped, and we just did not participate in the numismatic event because it just felt so weird.
Yeah, well, I mean, like it is an older I mean, I go to shows twice a month in terms of numismatic shows, and it is mainly people in their, I'd say an average age of 40, 45, because there are younger people there now. The parents bring their children. There are some younger people in the numismatic hobby, just like in the sports card hobby, right?
Hmm.
There are younger people involved. It's just that in this hobby, like stamp collecting, it doesn't penetrate into the younger age groups.
I think it will now with the digital nomads and how everyone, especially post 2020 type stuff, if you know what I'm getting at, that people are kind of more aware of the value of multiple passports, and people are like everyone, all of my followers, they're all about getting multiple passports. And
Well,
then so I think inherently they'll start being like, you know what, having some historic passports is kind of cool.
let me actually digress to some of your listeners looking for multiple passport. I'm going to give you some advice. All right. Now, this is my Israeli friend who actually has a large collection. He has not only an Israeli passport, he has a Romanian passport.
Hmm.
He has a passport for Chile.
Hmm.
Now, ask me how he got those.
By descent.
That's correct. He got it because he had his ancestors' original emigration papers from the early 1900s, from where they came from. And they gave him citizenship in Chile and in Romania. Interesting, huh?
Yeah, yeah, that's a big thing.
So, any of your listeners, let's say you're of Jewish descent like me, and your ancestors were chased out of a country in Europe at some point, you can get citizenship back in that country if you can prove that your ancestors were from there. Good example is Germany. If you wanted a German citizenship, now I'll tell you a story related to me. One of my cousins married a Rosenthal. All right. Now, I went to that wedding. That was 1971. So they're in their 70s now. The parents of the son who married my cousin, who's a woman, they were from Germany. And the story was in 1932, the gentleman's name was Hugo. All right. And Hugo was a family doctor in Germany. And he had a small office. And his wife was a world class bridge player. Interesting, huh? Anyway, Hugo was in his office, and an SA stormtrooper was standing in front of the office and preventing patients from going inside for reasons we discussed earlier, right? And he went outside to told the guy to move away from the door so the patients could come in. And they literally beat the hell out of him. All right. And he turned to his wife, Helen, and said, "We're leaving." And this is before Hitler took power in 33. It was late 1932. And he got an immigration visa to go to the United States with his wife. And they went to Cleveland and they settled in Ohio. And they lived there the rest of their life. His sons and grandchildren can now become German citizens. This is the whole point of the story, is they just apply. They have proof that Hugo and Helen, their grandparents, came from Germany and they left under duress. And now they can go back and become German citizens. No problem. And there are many examples like that. So maybe your listeners have some relatives that were once in a country they'd like to get extra citizenship and they can apply. They usually have to get an attorney to help them do that, by the way. There's some expense to it.
Hmm. Hey everybody, hey everybody. Quick break from the podcast to tell you about Language Blend, the best new way to learn Spanish. Language Blend was co-founded by Jake Nomada, friend of the podcast, decade of experience in Latin America, and Jake and his team, they put everything into this program that they wish they had in terms of how to level up quickly with your Spanish language skills. Because the faster that you can get conversationally fluent in Spanish, the better the experience that you're going to have in Latin America. So go to languageblend.com for more information. Yeah, no, definitely. Um, we definitely talk a lot about citizenship by descent on Twitter. Twitter's where we're often most active. That's definitely our most active thing, other than the podcast. I know there are some listeners that aren't on Twitter but listen to my podcast. So, guys, by the way, at My Latin Life on Twitter, like we're active 24/7 there, and we talk a lot about citizenship by descent. Um, just as an aside, Ross, I wanted to just get back to passport collecting as a discipline. Like,
Yes.
how many people, like, so many questions about it as a discipline, but how many people do you think who are actually active collectors? And it sounds like you've kind of connected with a bunch. Is there a conference? Like, how do people get together? Could you talk about it as a discipline a bit?
That's a great question. As far as I know, the closest thing to, let's say, a passport convention, but it's not for passports, is the London Antiquarian Fair. And the London Antiquarian Fair is just a fair that basically sells books and papers, and passports are part of it. That's really the only one I know. The fellow that I know in Thailand that has a website, he has what they call passport collector meetings, but it's really, he travels to Europe. He's of German descent, so he goes to Switzerland or Belgium or the Netherlands to visit family. And he has a passport meeting with a few people that he knows that buy from him on his website. And he calls it a passport collectors convention. But it really isn't. I think that if I don't even know how to organize such a thing. I actually thought about that about 4 or 5 years ago before COVID, and getting some of the world's most well-known passport collectors to meet in, let's say, Singapore, at a hotel, and might draw 10 to 20 people, but that's a very small number of people, right? In the United States, I don't think that you'd be able to drum up enough people, let's say 100, in any one place like New York, that would say go to a hotel and have a bunch of dealers that would sell these. There aren't that many dealers of documents out there. Now,
how many are there? How many dealers of documents are there?
There could be hundreds in the world, but they're so scattered. I mean, like, and they're private. In other words, I'm on some what do you call it? Let's say WhatsApp, okay, or Viber. These are all like messaging services, right? An instant messenger. I get people that reach out to me through the Instagram that own, let's say, antique shops. Let's say in the Middle East. Let's give that example. And they will like have a communication open with me, and that's how I buy from them. And they're, if you want to call them a dealer for lack of a better term, they're making a profit selling me a document that they were able to procure. Mm-hmm. That's the best way I could describe it. There's no store you're going to go into. I mean, you'd go bankrupt because the scattering of passport collectors is so widely distributed that you wouldn't be able to put a grouping together to make it economically feasible. Yeah. What my friend's doing online, I'll give him a plug. So if anybody's interested, my friend George Tudor, Tudor, he lives in Bucharest, Romania. He has a website called www.passport-collection.com. All right. Now, George Tudor sells passports on that website. And if people are interested in buying either biometric types for the younger crowd, he sells them. If people want the older types, like from 100 years ago or older, he sells them. So if anybody's interested, they can go to that. That's sort of like going to a shop, but it's online, and he's legitimate. He's not going to steal your money. And if you wanted to get some documents from him, you could. I actually sent him 50 of my more common passports for him to sell at a low price, which is like between like 30 and 60 euros each. And they're on his website. So that's why I'm giving him a plug, because some of my stuff is on there.
Yeah, I'm kind of scrolling right now. Pretty cool.
So there's, I'm sorry?
So it's like cheaper ones are around like, $60 ish, and then more expensive ones can easily be $400 or $500.
Oh, more than that. He's got some real rare birds on there. But George is probably the largest collector of British colonial passports in the world, and he's written 2 books. He wrote one book on Nansen travel documents. He wrote another book on British colonial passports. And I'm not sure he offers them on his site, but if he wanted a copy, you could probably send him a message and you could buy it.
I'm going to get into this, Ross. I'm getting into this, like 100%.
You like that, huh? And I think some of your listeners might like it. And if they go onto my page and they're looking for a specific document that I may have a duplicate of, I could sell it to them so they could contact me through the messaging portion like you did on IG. Or I have an email that I link to my TikTok page, and you can contact me that way too, and have no problem with selling a document to people. The hardest thing for me sometimes is that, like, I find some things from my IG followers that I'd like to buy. But I'll give you a quick example. I wanted to buy a colonial passport that was French colonial for Niger. All right, Niger is a very small country in central, northeast,
Yep.
northwest Africa. Okay,
Yep.
so Niger is like on the bucket list of people that are going to travel, like Mauritania. You ever watch The Bold and the Bankrupt on YouTube?
Yeah. Low key, Niger is like a very large country, but it's just unknown.
Right. Well, Niger was known as what under the French? Upper Volta. Okay.
Okay.
This guy contacted me on my IG page, had two Upper Volta French colonial passports from the 1950s, 60s he wanted to sell me. But I just know, I kind of think it was like a scam, like if you could send money to people and they'll take
Right.
it and they'll not send you.
Like, how
So,
do you, yeah, you do like cash on arrival or something. How do you even know, damn, what was I going to ask? Sorry, keep going.
no, so like for me, unless I'll try to establish a relationship with people. In other words, I like using PayPal to pay for something, not friends and family. All right, because if you use friends and family, then there's no recourse. If you use buyer's protection, that's why PayPal's so good. If someone tries to cheat you, you could make a claim. All right, so and there's extra expense when you buy using regular PayPal versus friends and family. It's like 5%. So once you get a relationship with somebody, like I have with Ashok in Egypt, or Tehar in Egypt that I buy stuff from, or people I have a relationship with, I'll send them the money, friends and family, because I know they're going to send me the documents. I buy stuff on a regular
Yeah.
basis.
Yeah. It's some
But
trust.
if I don't know you, I'd rather get the documents, and you're going to have to trust me that I'm going to send you the money as soon as I receive them.
Yeah.
I just can't like spend like $200-300. Here's a good story. I'm going to tell you this one. I have a friend in Tripoli. All right. Now I'm not going to get into the politics of how Libya was hijacked in 2012, but let's just say the U.S. doesn't like Libya. Put it that way. All right. He sends me using DHL a 1968 Kingdom of Libya passport. It's before Gaddafi's regime. Okay, it's rare. I paid $300 for it. It's been sitting in the U.S. Customs in New York for 100 days. Sitting there. Has to be cleared. Now, it makes me angry when I think about it, because what is wrong with these people? It's a canceled, with stamps, expired passport from a country that doesn't exist anymore. And they're holding it like it's a contraband.
So how
Like
does it not exist anymore? It had a different name, or?
Well, it was the Kingdom of Libya.
Okay,
It
gotcha.
doesn't
Yeah.
exist anymore,
Yeah.
right?
Gotcha.
Right now you have whatever it is now. I don't know what they call it now, but what is the Kingdom of Libya? That's one of the more dangerous places for your travelers to get their stamp from right now, right? But back in the early '70s, you could probably go there, and travel through it. But I'm like upset when that happens, because what do? I'm going to have to write a letter now to the head of the customs office in New York with the DHL tracking number and say, can you please send it to me, or at least send it back to the guy that sent it to me if you don't want me to have it, so that I can get my $300 back. It's like nuts. It's crazy.
Yeah. Um. So many questions. Are you good on time? Because I could keep going. I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm fine. You could do the editing afterwards if you want.
No, I know. I mean, everything's a little bit out of order because there's just so many cool little subtopics around this stuff. But I definitely so just to finish the thought about um, passport collecting as a discipline. Again, how many people you say do you think are actually involved in this hobby? How many
Well,
collectors do you think there are?
I can tell you that I probably increased it at least twofold with just my pages. I can probably tell you that, right? But there may be people, you have to make a distinction. Who are really the true hardcore collectors versus someone who's casual and maybe wants to pick up a couple of documents to have as a
Right.
collectible, right? I would probably say there are more of the latter that, but just don't know where to shop for.
Right. I can kind of get that. Like the Jewish guys, they just want a couple things from like
Right,
World War II or
right,
Israel or whatever. I get
right.
that, or things that have like a personal connection. But you have everything. You have shit from Asia. You have everything.
Yeah, I have a varied. I guess being a physician, I need to keep my mind occupied. I'm not like listen. I sit down at night. Your listeners will find this funny. I don't like watching the news or regular TV because it's too depressing. So I watch baseball with my wife. She's a big baseball fan, and I am too. So we'll sit down and we'll watch baseball, and I keep the. You didn't ask me this question. How do I store these things? Right.
Ooh,
So
okay.
all right. So I'll get into that. So I let's say I put them in a binder, and I take a binder of documents and I'll put it in my lap and I'll start looking through it. And sometimes you find something new every time you look at one. They're very complex documents if there's a lot of travel in it. So that's one thing I do, and it makes me calm. I'm like it's like my Prozac. You know what I'm saying? So that's what I use to keep calm. I like to read about history, although the way things are going, people are making the same mistakes that we made last couple hundred years. You know what I mean? But getting back to how I store these items, because people yell at me online. I mean, sometimes they say inappropriate stuff like, why are you posting this? It's an invasion of privacy. Use gloves. I have a few people who collect antiquarian books that I'm friendly with. He never uses gloves. When you look on Antiques Roadshow, that's, for some items, I guess you want to use gloves, but for this stuff, you don't need to. All right. The biggest problem with old documents is some staple corrosion in the booklets. Some of the staples were made poorly, particularly in French passports, and they tended to rust over the years.
Mm.
Also, you can have documents that have foxing, which is sort of like a fungus. And to get rid of the foxing or stabilize it, my Israeli friend uses benzene, which I don't particularly like because that's a carcinogen. But he dunks the document literally in benzene, right? And it kills the fungus and the
Like the
foxing
paper and
stops.
everything.
Yeah, the whole thing. It doesn't damage the paper. It's an oil distillate. So I went to visit him, and he did one of these in front of me, where he took a very, very fragile document and literally soaked it in benzene on his. He lives in an apartment, on his apartment ledge outside the apartment, because it smells. It's benzene. And then he takes the document out and lets it dry in the air, and it dries almost instantly because it's a petroleum distillate, like alcohol. So that's how he kills the foxing. But I don't really get into that too much. But what I do is I buy, let's say, archival PVC free postcard sheets. They're plastic, a form of plastic, but they're PVC free. They're archival safe. And they come two to a page. And about 100 of them will run you about $23. And then I'll go to a Staples and I'll buy a binder, a 9x12 binder, and I put the pages in the binder. And then I have a German company that's into really stamps. It's called Lindler. They sell stamp supplies, but they also sell different size, for lack of a better term, like a archival holder. Like some are 100 by 170 millimeters, some are 190 by 120 millimeters. I'm using metric because that's how it is on these little sub sheets. They're not. So I put the document in whatever one size that's appropriate, right? I buy some stickers from Staple and I label what the document is and what's important about it on that little label. And I put 2 documents per of those little sheets I told you about.
Mm-hmm.
And I put them in a binder. So basically I could fit maybe 20 to 30 documents per binder, 2 to a page. If those are booklet style, all right? If I collect a sheet, the sheet styles I referred to earlier before 1915, I get an artist's book. Like, in other words, people who have like certain, let's say, drawings of their art, they put it in a archival binder with like some black crepe paper behind it to keep it safe. I find those in Staples. They come in 3 different sizes, perfect for passports. And you just slide the single sheet passport into the page. And that's how I store them. And I went and I bought, try to visualize this. If you go to, let's say, a doctor's office or a hospital, a patient's chart, now it's all electronic. But a couple of years ago, they used to have paper charts, and they were binders, and they were put onto like a dolly, like a library dolly, where you go to a library and see how people about the books have to be reshelved, and you see the librarian pushing this library dolly, in the library to put the books back on the shelf. Well, they make these library dollies for hospitals, and I found a couple of them on Wayfair, and I bought them for $184 a piece. They're like have rollers, and they're perfect for the binders. So I just slide the binders onto each shelf, and I can pull the binder off and just look at any number of documents. That's how I store it. Now, I haven't gotten to organizing them yet, meaning taking them out of the binders and organizing them by a theme, whether it's, let's say, World War II, World War I, pre-1900. I've not got around to doing that. Eventually I will, but that's how I store the documents in a nutshell.
Okay. No, that's good. I mean, oh man. Kind of reminds like I'm almost thinking I'm picturing like Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh cards, but
you think about that. Let's say you're a Pokemon card collector and you put them in a binder, right? Before you go out and you play with them, like my stuff is I have some old baseball stuff from when I was a kid. I collected baseball cards, and I kept the ones I collected when I was 8 years old, believe it or not, until I was like 13. And I have them in binders, just like that.
Binders.
Binders.
Okay, I feel like the storage isn't going to be too interesting to people, even though it is actually like a good tip, because I imagine that if you just leave them out or leave them in a safe, that they'll get molded up and stuff.
Well, some people do that. Some people just put them in a shoebox. I've seen people do that. I've seen people.
I get them. They must get moldy.
Well, my friend in Israel buys these giant plastic tubs that you find in like Walmart, and he just puts them in like chock-a-block 2 levels high in these, plastic tubs.
Shoebox, that's good. I mean, I probably would do the Nike shoebox thing too. And sorry, just finishing the thought about like how big is this? How many like hardcore collectors do you think there are? And do you ever find that like when like a really rare thing comes up that people snatch it out from under you, or when something comes up, does it like what is the what's the real estate term? What's the real estate term for like how quick a house sells? You know what I mean? Is it you know what I mean? Like how quick does something sell when it comes up? So how many hardcore collectors do you think there are?
I'm going to say it really it's so variable and depends on the item. All right. Number 2, I couldn't even make a number. I'm going to say, let's say around the whole world, maybe 1,000. That's it in the whole world. That means there are people that are willing to spend more than $1,000 on a document.
Okay.
All right. That may be in the whole world, 1,000 people. So before that, you may have some casual collectors that'll spend a couple hundred or less than 100 on a document because, financially, some people can't afford it. So it's so variable. That's why selling them, you can see an auction where they go off and they don't go. It surprises you. Some documents go for a lot more money than you think. I'll give you an example. I wanted to buy this on an auction site. A 2009 to 2012 Venezuelan passport. And I wanted it because it was the time of Chavez. And it was actually used to travel to a controversial country, I think. I can't remember the country, but it had a double importance. It was issued in Venezuela at the time of Chavez. And I'm not sure if it was I think it was an ordinary passport. It went for $345. I didn't think it was going to go for that much, but it was a biometric. It was a modern one, right? Because they were putting out the biometrics in 2009, 2010. And for some reason, the younger crowd, like your age, loves these biometric passports.
You mentioned that a couple of times. Sorry to interrupt. Why? What is that? What is that? Why would a young person want a biometric passport and older people want the older stuff?
I just think it's you guys are younger and you're not into as much the historical stuff. I don't want to like paint a broad stroke here, putting people in a category, but from what I've seen, a lot of the younger people in their 20s and 30s love the biometric passports. And they're the new stuff that's out, So finding a biometric passport is expensive. They can run for like 150 euros to like 400 euros, right, for certain countries. And if you ever find a service or a diplomatic, it's even more expensive. So, and all that is because it's the modern technology. I mean, if you see the guy on TikTok who has his own channel, he takes out a black light and he shows you the anti-counterfeiting parts of the document that they do nowadays. And it's basically got personal information on there. So I try to, person's still alive, personal information. The stuff, like I told you, I like to collect stuff that's old enough where the people are not with the living anymore.
Yeah,
So
that makes sense to me. I saw on the dude's site, the passport-collection.com site, it was like a random New Jersey driver's license from like barely 10 years ago. I'm like,
yeah, because
the hell is that about?
Because I'm trying to tell you, he sells anything. That
Yeah.
I don't necessarily agree with George on selling some of those items, but that's his choice. But that's not what I collect or would care to sell. That would kind of get the attention of some authorities when you do that. On a side note, I was screened. I came back from Israel one time, and I visit my friend who's a collector. I'll give a couple of plugs out. One of my friends, he has a web page called Our Passports. He's an Israeli guy named Neil. He really does a hell of a lot of research on documents. He also has a Twitter page that's called Our Passport. So if you want to check out his Twitter page, you can. And he's got about almost 10,000 followers on Twitter. But Neil is very smart. He collects a lot of the old stuff that I collect. And, when I came back from visiting him one time, we're like brothers. I've seen him at least 6, 7 times. I've flown out to meet him. I came back, and in Kennedy Airport, I was stopped by Homeland Security. All right. And they took my computer and they took my cell phone and they started asking me questions. And I said, I go and visit family and friends in Israel and I collect old passports. And I had my book of documents with me and I showed the agent the documents and there's nothing illegal about it. And after 45 minutes, they let me go. Interesting, huh? Now, when I went back this time, they didn't stop me. So it was basically, I'm not on a list, but it was a random check. And they checked me.
So you think you're on a list now because of all this passport collection?
No, I said I thought I would have been on a list, but they didn't stop me this time. So if they didn't stop me this time, if I was on a list, they would have stopped me again when I came back this year. But they didn't. So it was just a random check.
Gotcha. And damn, what was I going to ask? I got a million questions about this stuff.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think there's any like famous collectors?
Oh yeah. You gave me a good thought to talk about. Like, what would you say? You say, Ross, what's the most expensive documents out there to buy? Right? Mm-hmm. It's not those ones I was describing all through our talk. It's a celebrity's passport. So the most expensive passports that have sold in the last 20 years, the one that comes to mind is Lou Gehrig's passport from his trip to Japan to play baseball in 1935. It went for $200,000 because it's sports related. Yeah. All right. That's the most expensive one. John F. Kennedy's passport from the 1930s when he was studying in Europe before World War II. That went for about $50,000 or $60,000. All right. Marvin Gaye's passport was recently sold. Went for about $10,000. A lot of celebrities, their passports go for a lot of money. Depends on who follows the celebrity. Can go. I mean, like think of like say Joe Frazier, the boxer. His passport sold very expensive. Muhammad Ali, same thing. But also like a statesman like Anwar Sadat. His passport went for like $10,000. It was an Egyptian diplomatic passport. So some of them can be very pricey. Depends on who it is. Like I've got, let's say you had Benjamin Franklin's passport when he went to France in the 1780s, right? I don't know if it exists or it's in a museum somewhere. That would be a lot of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
Yep.
Definitely makes sense. So I guess anything from a state that no longer exists is probably worth a lot of money.
No, not necessarily. I mean, I can get you a passport from Danzig, and it cost you $100.
That's cool.
It's not necessarily true. It's really only true if it's like it has a significant, let's say, historical context, has some unusual visas, well traveled. It really depends on the buyer, you know. Um, so I'm sitting here. I'm going to make a video for tomorrow's posting, and for $100, I picked up a set of two passports. I find them intriguing. I have to do a little research on them, but German nationals born in Germany in 1909, 1910, but became naturalized British citizens in 1937. And I think the husband was working for MI6 or MI5. You know what I'm saying? He was working for one of the alphabet agencies for Great Britain
Mm.
during the war.
Okay.
And so that's why I bought it, because of him. And I got his wife's passport. And they went back and visited Germany after the war and had some special stamps in there because you needed special permission to go to Germany after World War II for about 5 years. Same thing in Japan. You couldn't just go to Japan. Japan was a military government by Douglas MacArthur up until 1952, right? And even like Okinawa, this is interesting. Okinawa was a restricted area. That's where the U.S. Naval Base was, right? You needed a special military permit to fly into Okinawa. So those are rare. The Ryukyu Islands, they were called. So I actually have two passports I found on eBay, a mother and a son. And they were both from Okinawa and they were emigrating to the United States. She was a house cleaner, all right? And her passport is issued, I think, in U.S. The other one is the son's and was a consular issue. I'm going to get into that in a minute. From Naha, Okinawa. So it was an American passport issued in Naha, Okinawa, the Ryukyus, under restricted time for them to emigrate to the United States. It's one of my favorite documents because it was an area that people didn't travel to because of the military restriction.
Hmm. Okay. Um, I think maybe at the end we could drop any kind of like random nuggets you have. There were a couple because I know you've been generous with your time. There were a couple things I wanted to definitely get to. There are a couple of questions from Twitter that I wanted to ask just to
Sure.
pay respects to the Twitter people. But then also I really wanted to. It's crazy. We've gone an hour 40 minutes so far, and we haven't even mentioned Latin America in terms of what might be some unique characteristics to Latin America, what's the passport landscape down there, that kind of thing. So I thought maybe we could do a little Latin America time as well,
Oh yeah, and
because
then
that's our focus.
you want to
But
talk about like the Caribbean, Mexico
yeah,
south
yeah,
to
we could. Yeah, basically Mexico on down. But first, just a couple of quick questions from Twitter. One that you'll probably be somewhat familiar with. Hopefully, no disrespect or anything. But one was basically what happened to the Palestine passport, and what was kind of the passport situation with Palestine from uh, historic to present.
Oh boy, that's a big story. Now I'll preface this and say that I'm not a Zionist, right? I'm Jewish, but uh, I have coworkers. I work in Detroit as well as New Jersey, and all my coworkers are Shia Muslim people. So I have a very big respect for the Muslim people out there. I have lots of friends, and the thing I would say about that whole situation is that it's difficult. It has a lot of complexity. There were times where they came very close to settling it with land swaps when Rabin was alive. And when the Israeli right wing killed off Rabin, that actually, kind of killed the peace process because the people who followed Rabin were not interested in making a settlement with them. I also think that like Sadat, who was killed by the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a more radical wing of the politics there, that if Arafat signed the peace treaty with Rabin, he would have probably been assassinated
Okay.
too by
Yeah,
the
I guess that's
extreme.
totally unpassport related a
Yeah.
little bit, but
But let's talk about the passport and the travel in those areas and in South America. You're talking about like the movements. Well, let's say after partition. All right, let's go before partition. Let's go to the Middle East before 1920. Before 1920, the Middle East was a mixed area. You had Muslim people and Jewish people living in what was then the Palestine area under the Ottoman Empire. All right. So the Ottomans controlled the Middle East. After World War I, the British and the French divided up the Middle East. Right. No surprise there. So the French took Lebanon and Syria, and the British took the rest. And they established Transjordan and a Palestine mandate, right? Remember, you heard about the Balfour Declaration and all that stuff. They made a Palestine mandate. And so they had what they called British Mandate Palestine. And in 1923, they started issuing passports to both the Arab and Jewish population in Mandate Palestine. And Mandate Palestine, you can find documents up until the establishment of the State of Israel, which is 1948. Okay, and you could travel freely throughout the Arab world before 1948 without a problem. After 1948, Israel's first passports were what they called Etat Israel, which was the Israeli state, which is up until 1952, which was a laissez-passer. It wasn't a regular passport. It was a laissez-passer for a couple of years until they established the State of Israel. Then it became a standardized passport. On the other hand, with the Palestinians, they used two different passports. They used a laissez-passer that was issued by the Jordanian government for the West Bank settlements, and they used an Egyptian all-Palestine government passport issued between 1948 and used up until 1967 for the Gaza residents. So there were two different travel documents for the Palestinians. So what happened was, after 1967, Israel took over the West Bank, as you know, and they took over Gaza is like a restricted area, and they took over the Sinai Peninsula because Egypt retreated all the way across the Suez Canal, so Gaza was isolated, right? So those all Palestine government passports no longer were valid. Now, I have several of those posted on my IG site, anybody who's interested in seeing that. And I only have one example of the Jordanian laissez-passer used for the West Bank. They're not that easy to find, believe it or not, both types. And that's how they used them. They could travel on an all-Palestine government passport. You can go to Europe with it. Mainly it was used to go to Egypt or the Hajj in those days. But my Palestinian friends loved seeing that passport because it sort of legitimizes that they had a government at one point that put out a document like that. Now, the Palestinian Authority puts out a passport. I don't have any examples in my collection, but they put out a biometric passport for Palestinian people to travel, say to the Hajj or some other location based on the Palestinian Authority. And I see some of them for sale every once in a while on auction sites. I hope that answers your question without getting into politics too much.
Yeah, very cool. One more question. So how does one go about finding antique passports? We've kind of talked about that a fair bit, but we talked about eBay, specialty shops, online stores. Are there any just places that you might want to add to that list?
Well, eBay was one, but eBay, it's a love-hate relationship. In other words,
Sure.
eBay, it's like the story is that there was a long time where you could sell anything on eBay, right? But then they went into restricting the sales of passports. And they're in that mode right now where they restricted the sale of passports that they have to be a certain age and they have to have a certain cancellation. And this is for American eBay. Now, eBay is divided into different areas. So if you go to Swiss eBay or German eBay or Italian eBay or French eBay, they'll sell passports on there with different restrictions. In other words, you have more access on those foreign eBays than you do American eBay. That's the end of that story. There's a website called Delcamp, Delcampe, delcamp.net. And they're a Belgian auction house. They also sell a lot of passports on there that I collect. Problem was Delcamp had an issue with the U.S. revenue services. In other words, you notice when you buy something on eBay now that the tax is included, correct? If you buy an item, if you bought anything on eBay recently, they charge you tax for it, right? Mm-hmm. Well, Delcamp didn't want to be bothered with that. So there were 20 states in the United States that said either you're going to resolve this collecting taxes for us situation on a sale, or you're going to be banned from the state from selling Del Camp in our state. So about May 1st or so, they came out with a rule where Del Camp literally, discarded all people's accounts in the United States that were from 20 different states, including New Jersey. They couldn't buy on Del Camp anymore. Del Camp wouldn't open their site in those states. So I had to use one of my offices. I use my doctor's office in New York address in order to open a new Del Camp account because New York State is not affected. New Jersey was.
Okay,
So
it's like a place where you can create your own account and then sell your passports on there.
you could do that, or you could
Okay,
buy on there because they have
gotcha.
to ship it to you. So if you go to Del Camp, I'm bringing that whole story up because if some American listeners want to go to and establish a Del Camp account, if you're in one of these 20 states, you can't do it. That's the only point I brought that up.
Nice. Okay, good to know. What about just like random estate sales and things that are more local where I feel like you could get better deals because the people
Oh
live
yeah, well
there?
that's a needle in a haystack.
Yeah.
You know what I would say? Any Americans listening, go to like a gun show. And why? Not to get the guns, but sometimes they find documents there. You'll find like old papers in gun shows. Or let's say you go to another one would be a stamp show. Go to a postal stamp show, and like they might have a few documents there. But those are really reaches, you know. Or going to a flea market or an antique store. I used to go antiquing, though I very, very, very seldom would find an interesting document at any one of those venues. Very, very unusual. You may find more war trophies that GIs brought back going to a flea market or something like that, but you're not going to really find a lot of travel documents in those places. You can find them in an estate sale, and that's when these people that work on eBay locate some things and they put it for sale on their eBay account. That's how I get a lot of them because they do the work for me. They go to an estate, buy all the estate, they go through all the papers. Oh, I found this old passport. Okay, let's put it on our eBay and see how much it goes for. Sometimes they get like literally a needle in a haystack. Here's an example. Um, there was a Japanese puppet state called Manchukuo, which is Manchuria, right? Now, if you were a white Russian immigrant, I alerted to that earlier, where you were stateless, some of those bourgeois people from the Russian Empire, they lived in Manchuria. They lived in Harbin, or one of the cities in Manchuria.
Hmm.
And they were given Manchurian passports or Manchukuo passports. Well, if there was later when the Japanese occupation, those are rarer than hen's teeth. All right, very, very, very rare. And somebody from an estate, I guess somebody lived in Manchukuo, and they came and immigrated to the States, and they threw these old Manchukuo passport in a drawer. The person died, and it went for sale on eBay. It went for $3,000. Extremely rare passport. Just a story or an example of something that came out of like an estate. But they're very rare and far between those stories.
Mm. And I guess before we get to Latin America, what are some of the rarest documents out there? I guess there's a million like kind of one-offs really when it comes to
Yeah, you can look at it
like
in that
what
bullet.
are like the most coveted things? Like if I had to use a Pokemon analogy, like what's the holographic Charizard or the what is it in base? What's the baseball one? Like I don't know, like
Like a Mickey Mantle card, the home
Mickey
run.
Mantle, a Babe
All right,
Ruth. What's the
all right,
what's the
well,
Babe Ruth of passport collecting?
I would say if I were to go over 10 really rare documents, right, I'm using a general sense. One of them would be any very well known celebrity or politician. That's
Hmm.
obvious. All right. Number two would be a country that doesn't exist or had a lot of political turmoil, like North Korea, right?
Hmm.
Or, a diplomatic passport from one of those types of countries, expensive document. All right. An example of a wartime document used to escape a situation under duress, also a popular item. Uh, Anything that has to do with a historical event, like say signing a treaty, and one of the people who are signing the treaty, you have their passport. That's also uh, a very significant document. A country we talked about like the Holy See, Nauru, the postage stamp countries. Of course, they have a value. Trying to think of what else. Something that's early, like I'm not going to publicize the other fellow's site because I'm not enamored with him. He's a little on the arrogant side, so I don't publicize him. But he put out an article on his website of a passport from 1565 that's owned by a collector in the Netherlands. That was the king's passport from 1565. Very rare, unique item, expensive, obviously. So those are just some examples.
Hey guys, quick interruption to tell you about Bitrefill. Bitrefill is the best way to convert your crypto into gift card balances. These are gift cards that you can spend at hotels.com, Airbnb, Nike, and many more. You may remember Joel Valenzuela, previous podcast guest. He's been living on crypto exclusively since 2015, and he's a big consumer of Bitrefill. And so I asked Joel, I said, what do you like most about Bitrefill? He said that he likes the instant delivery, the precise amount so that you don't have to juggle a lot of gift cards, and he loves the global selection. Nobody else has this much selection of gift cards, over 10,000 gift card options across hundreds of countries. Go to bitrefill.com to sign up, and you can also use the code MyLatinLife for 10% back off your first purchase. Go to bitrefill.com for more information. Okay, I like it. If we could move over to Latin America, and by the way, thanks again for your time.
Yep.
I'd say we've definitely had some episodes that have gone over 2 hours, but it's not the majority, so I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Latin America, are there any characteristics that are common to the Latin America region? Or I guess before I get into any detailed questions, like, do you just want to kind of go off on, Latin America a little bit in terms of things that you've witnessed there, or what?
Yeah.
What
Well, I mean,
things about it?
obviously, people on your site want to get second citizenships or residences in some of these places, and the most popular would be, in my opinion, like that are less dangerous, would be certain cities in Colombia, or Ecuador, or Chile, or Argentina, or Uruguay. Those are probably the safest places. I'd probably stay away from Brazil. That doesn't certain other countries where you watch the Bold and the Beautiful's travels, on YouTube, and you get a sense of what's safe and what's not safe. But in terms of what I collect, I've got a lot of stuff from Latin America, South America. Things, the harder ones to find, believe it or not, are from certain Central American countries, like let's say British colonial Honduras or
Yep.
British Guyana, right? But the ones after independence may be a little less difficult to find. I think I just, from my friend in Croatia, I just bought from him a 1946 passport from El Salvador. It's the only one I have in my collection.
That's cool.
It's hard to find. El Salvador is not common. I've got, when I collect Mexico, I usually like to limit it to the 1930s and 40s, not the modern stuff, and I have some really interesting ones, diplomatic and service from those. I've got Americans who traveled to South America in the 1930s through the 1960s on different missions, either for the government or private travel, right? I've got single sheet passports from Peru, Cuba. Trying to think of my single sheets. Oh, man. I think those are the only ones that are really old single sheets. The rest of the stuff I have are booklet form. So I have Chilean diplomatic passports from the 1950s and 60s. Cuban. I have Fulgencio Batista's son's passport. I just picked it up. He's 82 years old. He lives in Florida. I found it on eBay. Batista's son, who was the president of Cuba before Castro, right? What else? Dominican Republic is tough. very difficult to find passports from the DR. I have one from the 1980s and one from 1932, which is exceptional. I have a 1928 passport from Ecuador, exceptional. In fact, when I posted that, these are all posted on Instagram. They told me that's from an elite family in that country that controls a lot of land and money. The people who that are related to the person who held that. He was actually the ambassador for Ecuador in Germany in 1928. The passport number is number three, and it's a diplomatic. Right? So I have some really rare, interesting documents related to South America. Uh, Argentina, I've got Argentina military attaches during the time of Juan Perón. I've got, I like Chile a lot. Ecuador, I have Bolivia, I've got Paraguay, I've got Uruguay, Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela. I don't have. That's one of the ones I'm missing.
Are you?
Um,
So which ones are you missing in Latin America?
I'm missing some of the smaller states like Guatemala, uh, Belize, Guyana, uh, Venezuela. Uh, I may have, I've got these extraordinary Peruvian passports from the 1940s that I posted them. In fact, one of these people, like they say that's their grandfather, just sent me a message like you did on my Instagram page. So I don't know what to do about that, but I've got quite a few from Peru, including some really interesting old ones. Um, yeah, I'm missing a few of the smaller countries in South and Central America, but otherwise I have an example from most of them.
Have you heard of a country called Los Altos, which was between Mexico and Guatemala that existed for like not even 10 years?
No, there's a lot of what they call fantasy passports or a breakaway region, sort of like I was referring
Yeah,
to
yeah.
with Katanga, right? Or Biafra. Those are very valuable if you could find them. I wish I had a Katanga passport or a passport from Biafra, but I don't. And maybe this Los Altos is one of those breakaway province like
No, it
South
was a real
Sudan.
country for a little bit. Um,
I've never seen a passport from there. Now
yeah.
there are fantasy passports. I have one from Catalonia, which
Uh-huh.
is not a breakaway of Spain, but it's called a fantasy passport, and I posted it. And I got to tell you, between the Catalonians that live in Barcelona and the Spaniards, they're yelling at each other over this on
That's
my
funny.
IG page.
That's
Not
funny.
only that, I posted one from Spanish Guinea, and you could imagine the arguments between the Spanish people about that. It's like I called it a colony. Now, God, that was a bad thing for me to say because the Spanish referred to it as a province of Spain.
Mm.
But you know something? I think they're full of baloney.
No, there's a
I
lot of.
think,
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, I think that if you were a Ghanaian, Equatorial Guinean in this poor country, and you wanted to go live in Seville, Madrid, Barcelona, do you think they're going to let you do that? If it's a colony, you know what I mean? They won't freely accept those people to live up there. So, in my opinion, they call it a province by name, but it really was a colonial. They covered it up by calling it a
Yeah.
province.
No, it makes
Yeah.
sense. Random thing that came to my mind. Do you have like these are just random examples. Do you have like maybe um like Texas before it became a part of the United States when it was like an independent country?
I'm
That would be
looking for
cool.
one.
That would
I'm
be
looking
cool.
for one. That's a
Or
very, very expensive passport.
yeah,
That'll cost like 5 to 10 grand if I find one that's in good condition. Very
or
expensive.
there's a lot of examples of like breakaway things or
Yeah.
there's so many kind of weird anomalies in the world where you have like let's just say with the Spain example like Ceuta, which is like, and all those little
Well, there's fantasy
spots.
country. There's fantasy country.
It's not fantasy those, but it's like how there's like a couple Spanish regions that are actually on the African continent in Morocco. And there's just like a
Oh, yeah,
million like
Spanish Morocco. Yeah,
yeah.
one of my followers sent me a video of his grandfather's passport from Spanish Morocco, and I posted it. It's on IG.
Yeah,
But
cool stuff.
but I can tell you that there are like I call fantasy countries or camouflage passports, right? And I don't collect those, but what would more interesting to me is a counterfeit passport. I mean, they're rare. I don't have one, but I have one that's sort of like a movie prop. It can't be called the counterfeit, but it's not a real one. And I got fooled on it. I lost $300 in terms of I thought it was real, but I'll tell you what it is. It's a 1940 German diplomatic passport used in Spain. And the way the person, I got it on an auction site, but the person didn't put real clear images up when I looked at it. And when I told him it was fake, he goes, I'm not accepting any returns. That was your risk. You should have seen it, looked at it more closely. He was kind of mean. And I said, all right, I'm just going to keep this as an example. And I created a video showing what a real one versus a fake one looks like and how you can tell the difference of a counterfeit document versus a real one. So it was a learning experience.
Hmm. And just continuing on Latin America, like, are there any other maybe interesting anomalies about Latin American passports and travel documents that are, let's say, coveted in the passport collecting world?
Not really, but I can tell you some of the sizes of the documents differ and vary. I mean, some of the Argentine documents from the 1950s, and Chilean, they're very small, like small booklet size. I mean, almost looks like a toy, but that was their passport. Yeah. I wish I mean, I probably posted a few on IG. You could see them, but they're really small. Like I'm talking about like 2 inches
Yeah.
by 3 inches, very tiny.
What about like colonial documents from before? Because these countries are pretty new. Like a lot of them only are, 100 something years old. Like, what about like Spanish or Portuguese colonial documents from
Oh,
Latin America?
those are very well coveted. They're hard to find. Like you're talking to the right person. I'd love to collect some of them, but you don't see them very often. Like every time I have a lot of patients that I take care of that are from some of these places in South America and Africa, right? And I ask them, I say, listen, I'll pay you very well if you have any relatives in Ghana, right, that have a Gold Coast colony passport,
Hmm.
you know? And so far, I've only had one patient in all my years of practicing that gave me a passport for Antigua, colonial Antigua,
Hmm.
very rare, British colonial Antigua. And it was her passport from 1961 when she was a little girl, and she gave it to me. I thanked her profusely. It's a very rare passport because it's British colonial Antigua. So any of those British possessions in the Caribbean, they're very rare. Trinidad, Tobago, Jamaica, Barbados, any of those places that were British colonies, finding their colonial passport, very rare.
Yeah, no, definitely makes sense. Um, okay. And is Central America a little bit different in any way than South America?
No, it's all same.
All same in terms of rarity and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the Spaniards really, you know, when they were there at the height of their power, the Portuguese and the Spaniards explored a lot of the world in the 1500s and 1600s, as you read in your history books. And the Spaniards extracted a lot of wealth out of South and Central America over the centuries
Hmm.
until the 19th century when America kind of got more involved, if you want to use that term.
Yep. Yeah, I think it's a cool period. I mean, there's definitely some documents out there. Maybe I'll have to get into. What do you think if I wanted to start collecting specifically Latin American documents, and you're my advisor, Ross. You're gonna tell me how to start being a passport collector, and I'm gonna start collecting Latin American documents. What should I collect, and maybe like how should I go about it?
All right, I would go for rarity and uh, uniqueness. So it goes in both ways. You could get rarity and uniqueness buying a modern biometric, if that's something that you want to focus on, or you could go for the older stuff like I collect. But I kind of either the document for me has to be very well traveled, or issued during a particular time. One example I have is a French diplomatic passport from 1961 for an attaché, and I think he was more of an intelligence officer, posted in Havana, Cuba, for the French. It was a very tumultuous time, 1961, 62, 63 in Cuba, right? That's a very interesting passport, one of my favorites. So you could choose by a political period. If you're not into that, you want something maybe that has a lot of travel stamps in it, right? I wouldn't buy anything that isn't hardly used unless it's a country like Katanga or a British colonial passport, because those it doesn't
And
justify the
again, why
cost.
is that? Because to me, like the fact that it's been used or has tons of stamps, like that's not to me at least. Like that wouldn't be the big draw. It'd be more just like this is sick. It's from 1940. I don't know. Like
Well, like I said, everybody, as they say in French, chacun a son goût. Everybody has their own
taste.
like and desire. And
Yeah.
so that's what I like, but you might like something different. And you might like something different that's simple and common and not expensive. So, like an example of that would just be getting an example of a passport from Mexico. You could find one for 20 or 30 euros. You know, it really depends on what your interest is.
Okay. And so just basically try to collect rare stuff. I guess the older the better. I'm guessing.
Well, I would say, yeah, quality items would be like a diplomatic or service passport, well used, older, also new. I mean, people collect diplomatic biometric passports and they're expensive, but they're kind of rare because the country usually doesn't release them because their people are still alive. We talked about that earlier. But if I were collecting, I would probably not get an example. Let's say I want to get this 1961 passport from Peru because I don't have a passport from Peru. Instead, I would get a diplomatic passport from Peru from the 1940s or 50s. Now that I know what I know, that's how I would go about it.
Got it. And I guess in Latin America, they probably don't really have too many auctions. They don't have too much eBay type stuff.
Well,
What
you
would
could
be like the
find
on the ground way to do this? Go to like antiquarians, antique
an
shops in Mexico
antiquarian
City, that
shop,
type of stuff.
an antiquarian shop, or a flea market. You could find. Listen, I mean,
Flea
I'll give you an
market.
example. I struck up a friendship with a Vietnam collector, right? And one of the holes in my collection is North Vietnam. I've got some very interesting Vietnam passports. I've got French Indochina to start, all right, when the French were there.
That's cool.
And after the French, I have the Republic of South Vietnam passports. Both I have the service and the diplomatic. Diplomatic's very rare. I've got two of those, and then I have the ordinary, which is green. So the ordinary is green, the service is tan, and the diplomatic is red. And I've got all three types. But I didn't have anything from North Vietnam. So I struck up a friendship with a North Vietnamese guy, and he saw my IG page and he wanted to make a trade with me. So he wanted a UN laissez-passer. The UN has its own travel documents, and they call them laissez-passer.
Hmm.
And they run for about $150 to $250 each, depending on the travel and the time it was issued. And I have several of them. So I said, okay, I'll trade you this laissez-passer you're interested in. And he traded me two North Vietnam passports. Very rare. Would never be able to find them in the United States. He probably found them in a flea market in Vietnam. One was from 1961 for a female student studying in Russia. No surprise there. And the travel stamps are from Russia and China to get there from Vietnam. Okay, that would be the route of travel. The other is much more interesting. The other is a 1951 Republic of North Vietnam passport issued to a famous painter, a Vietnamese painter from Hanoi, who traveled to Eastern Europe on expositions for his art in the 1950s. Fascinating, right? It's missing the front cover, but the rest of it's intact with some great visas in it. So that's one of my favorite passports, but it doesn't have the front cover. So not all the stuff that you find is going to be 100% intact. You have to be. Sometimes I didn't get into this topic, but sometimes you find stuff that's pretty beat up. But I just look at it at its more well loved, you know?
Mhm.
So I find stuff that's almost falling apart. A good example is like I have a Czech passport from 1922 or so, and it's used up until the 1930s, and it's for one of those refugees from White Russia. So the Russians had a refugee board called Refugee Rus. It was in French, right? Refugee Rus, Russian Refugee Organization. And that passport has stamps from Refugee Rus in it. Very interesting,
Mhm.
you know, aside from being a Nansen. So it's all beat up. I mean, it's falling apart. I have to be very careful when I handle it. But that's just an example.
No, I like it. And as we kind of get to wrapping up, maybe this isn't the best place to end things because I didn't want to talk about money, but I think it is kind of we definitely should talk about investing in these collecting passports as an investment, just because, geez, if you're gonna spend $500 for a document, $3,500 for a document, whatever, it'd be nice to know that you can get, that you can get a little bit of ROI at the end of it, or whatever it is.
You may or may not going into this. It's more of a labor of love.
Labor of
It's
love.
not. It's not something you're going to become like. I collect coins like you do. You seem to be a coin collector at some point in your life, and I can get money back from my numismatic stuff, the paper money and the coins. I bought an 1896 silver certificate in year 2000 for $130. It's worth over $1,000 now. All right, so you get the idea. You can make your money back and timely purchases in the past with numismatics, right? But with passports, it's really very different. You really kind of have to know the market and have a lot of experience in it if you're going to buy some things and hope to make a profit from it. And there are some people like George and his website. He knows the market very, very well. And he might buy something that's very rare for a couple $100 and flip it for 800 to $1,000 to $2,000 and make money. Same with my friend Anton in Croatia. He knows the market very well. And he'll buy something at a certain budget and flip it
Hmm.
and double his money.
Hmm.
So, yeah, you could do that. But, you know, there's a lot of work involved in having a business like that because you got to deal with difficult customers. Somebody's not happy that they did that or bought something. They have second thoughts. And you got to deal with that because I hear it from my friends who sell these things and they get aggravated when somebody's jacking them around regarding cost and availability and things like that. Of course, some people try to sell things for as much money as they can get away with. Now, I'll give you an example. A lot of the stuff from the Middle East is very pricey, right? Because a lot of it is really rare. Example would be the Kingdom of Libya passports I told you about, or I had an antique dealer from Amman, Jordan, really nice guy. Met him on IG. What a gentleman. And he said, "Hey, Ross, I have these two passports that are pretty rare. Are you interested in them?" And he didn't really take me to the cleaners on them. He sold them to me for $250 each, which I have to tell you, that's a steal, all right? Because those are easily, I could flip them for 1,000, 1,500 each to collectors because they're from not the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. They're from the Amorite of Jordan, the Amorite of Transjordan, which was the time when the king was involved in Transjordan rather than the British. So they're from 1941 and 44, respectively, with very good travel. Because this person was a businessman and he traveled from Amman into Damascus and Beirut, back and forth, 1941 to like 1946 on two different passports. So I was so happy to get those two. I'll never find those again. They're extremely rare. Some countries like Lebanon, it's illegal. When you talk about legality, it's illegal to take an old passport out of Lebanon by mail. They'll confiscate it. Same thing in Russia. They don't want their stuff mailed. They'll take it and they'll keep it. So when I get a passport from Lebanon, I usually have friends. I have some friends who are Lebanese who travel to Lebanon, and they'll go to this antique shop that finds me documents and they'll put it in their luggage and they take it home for me. And that's how I get it. Otherwise, you can't get Lebanese stuff. It's very hard. So I have some outstanding Lebanese passports from the 1930s up through the 1970s. Outstanding stuff.
And so, I feel like there are going to be more and more people collecting this stuff, and the prices are probably going to go up.
I would say yes and no because I think the economy. You see what's going on in the world, and I think money's going to get tighter, and class distinctions are going to get more sharp. And people in your generation, I think, are kind of getting screwed by this whole process. Not to get into all a side topic, but I think that this all relates to the availability of discretionary income.
It's
You know,
true, yeah, because these are the first things to go.
right. So either you're a wealthy like there, you use the term whale, right? There really is no whale in passport collecting. That's a gambling term when they try to get someone who's worth a lot of money into a casino. If you watch the movie Casino with Robert De Niro and the Japanese gambler, they call him a whale, right? He comes in, he's betting $10,000 a hand. There's no whale in passport collecting. If there was, we wouldn't be getting any of these documents because the whale would buy all of them. Meaning, let's say I was one of these rich baseball or basketball players that get $80 million contracts. You could buy whatever document that's ever put up for sale for a year and no one will bid against you. You follow me?
Hmm.
Because they have the discretionary income. So it's not gotten to the point where whales have gotten into the collecting hobby. It's sort of an offshoot of art. Some people that are whales, they buy big, expensive pieces of art as
Right.
a investment. Well, in a sense, these are similar. I mean, you and I agree; these are like art, similar.
It is
But
art. It's definitely
the,
artistic, yeah.
right, but the market is limited. That's what I think. It's not like art that's very expansive. Oh, they know it. That's a Picasso, that's a Renoir, et cetera, and so on, right? But nobody really knows because there's no definitive resource on a 1935 passport from Danzig and what its significance is. So either you have to know that from people that you meet and in the hobby who have long discussions with you, which I do, and over the years you understand. But to a new person collecting, it's very difficult what decision to make on what to buy.
All right, Ross. So as we're wrapping up, obviously wanted to thank you again so much for your time. It's been a very unique conversation, and I think people will definitely appreciate this one. So as we're wrapping up, do you have any last topics or themes that you want to get to before before we get to wrapping up?
Well, I mean, if most of your followers are more interested in getting IDs and second passports, like I said, the direct lineage way of doing it is the easiest, and try to find countries that are safe to live in as a retiree or a second home.
Hmm.
And the documents that I collect are sort of a reflection on some of those different countries and their status in the world. So, with that, I thank you for the interview. And if you have any further questions, you know where to find me as we discussed. And anybody who's interested in following some of my social media, you can go to the vintage.passport.collector page on Instagram, or you could find me at the Virtual Passport Museum on TikTok, or you could find me at the Passport Collector Group on Facebook. Those are the three main social media pages I have. And thank you for everybody's time.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, and sorry, I do want to ask one more question, and this will go in no editing. But have you looked at like Liberland e-residency? Have you heard of Liberland?
I haven't. Like I said, there's a lot of these sort of
Yeah,
uh,
it's like a micro. Have you looked into the micronation trend at all? I
right.
won't
Well,
call it a trend, but have you looked into this idea of micronations?
I seen it. I don't collect the documents, but I'm telling you, these micronations, in my opinion, are sort of like a money making opportunity. It's not really a true sovereign nation.
It's not, but there's some that are starting to get a little bit of recognition. Liberland's kind of one of the furthest advanced projects, and so we've talked to a couple like micronation people on the podcast and on Twitter and stuff. So I'd recommend looking into it.
Well, they're interesting. I mean, there's a guy who owns these platforms out in the North Sea or something near England.
Yes, yes. What is that one called? Sealand, I think.
Yeah, Sealand. But these are not recognized as one of the 192 countries in the world, you see? So this is the problem. It doesn't have UN representation. It doesn't have, it's not like tied in. These are like small, like micro
Yeah,
places that are really controlled by an individual seeking to establish some sovereignty where sovereignty may not exist. The platforms out in the North Sea, well, he bought those, so I guess you can create your own micronation there. But if you have like an island that's associated, that's not inhabited, that you just say, I'm going to put my flag up on this place and call it, Vacaville or whatever you want to call it, those countries are not going to let you
you
do
call
that.
it Vodkaville?
Yeah, Vodkaville or
I
whatever you
like
want to
that.
call it.
Damn, I like that. I like
Yeah,
that a lot.
but or Margaritaville, like Billy,
Right,
like Jimmy,
right.
they're not going to let you get away. Like there are people in the United States that like have little micro states within the United States, but they don't dare branch out to other than some marketing of selling a passport for their little micronation. There's no sovereignty there. You can't let you. I mean, you could go into an Indian nation if you are a Native American and it's sovereign, right? That's true. But these like little tiny sovereign places in Idaho and Nebraska or wherever people set them up.
Right. New Hampshire Free State Project.
Right. They're not sovereign
Yeah, it's not
countries.
sovereign, but it's kind of like what is a country? You know what I mean? And so these people are kind of pushing the idea, or just like, they're kind of pushing back on they're making you question like what is a country? I think it's pretty cool.
Well, I
It's a
mean,
cool initiative.
it's different, but I mean, like for instance, when it comes to brass tacks, when you have a community of people, everybody has sort of a role to play. Whether you're a farmer, a doctor, whatever your job is, and a micronation like that, I don't think it could stand for itself because they don't have enough, let's say, oomph to supply food and electricity and
Yeah.
just general stuff. I mean, you could think that, let's say, like a commune from the '60s, you could basically say those old communes were like micronations, right? Or a
Right.
kibbutz in Israel, like a micronation because they grow their own food and they have their own rules, and it's like that in some of these things you're describing, but they're not a recognized, sovereign country. But they do put out a document. They'll put out a passport.
No, I get it.
Like
Okay, one last quick question. What do you think about like the little citizenship by investment programs, largely in the Caribbean, like 150K for a passport?
that, I'm not necessarily a fan of that because I think they're profiting on people's anxiety issues with respect to what the future holds living where they presently live. And, some people like basically are afraid, okay, what if all hell breaks loose in this country? Where are they going to, where it's their escape route? I would basically, if I were looking for a country like that, I mean, Portugal's a wonderful place to retire in, right? And
Hmm.
they're looking for people, and it's not that expensive. Portugal, that's a good one, right?
Hmm.
Uh, if you can get into New Zealand, that would be great. It's probably very expensive, right? But some of these places you can emigrate to without having to pay expansive fees because they don't have enough people. New Zealand's one of them. Australia's one of them. Uh, Canada. I mean, you could apply for citizenship and not have to, get a permanent residence permit in these places, and eventually you'd become a citizen if you lived there 5 years.
Hmm.
Even Switzerland, right? But they're not easy. It takes time. Somebody in my age group that's in their 60s, they don't have that kind of time to wait. Someone in your age group in their 30s, you could definitely do that.
So there's a couple elements, but just the idea of being able to sell citizenship, like, is it something that's really earned and cultural, or is it something that can really exist in a marketplace? You know what I mean?
That's a great question, but it's a little bit of both. I think the earned and cultural is actually a better way to do it because they want you to learn the language instead of buying a citizenship for $100,000, investing in property or a business in one of these Caribbean countries or South American countries. And you have to make sure that it's safe because a lot of them aren't safe, right? There's a lot of crime in some of these places, and I would say buyer beware. Be very careful. I mean, watch the bold and the beautiful, the bankrupts. videos on YouTube. I mean, I'm giving him a plug because some of the places he goes are some of these poorer places that may offer a citizenship for a price, but it's not entirely safe.
No, it's true. Cool. Yeah, I just wanted to get your opinion on that real quick. I thought people might like that. But Ross, again, thank you so much for your time. This has been another episode of the My Latin Life podcast. Again, today with Ross from Vintage Passport Collector on Instagram, vintage.passport.collector. What is it again on Facebook and TikTok,
Facebook,
Ross?
Facebook, it's the Passport Collector Group, and on TikTok, it's the Virtual Passport Museum. But I'm really not posting that much on TikTok, only because they banned me several times, so I can't post.
Just the covers. No
Right,
no
just the covers.
insides. Yeah.
Correct.
Oh yeah. Funny stuff. Cool. Well, Ross, thanks again for your time. Thanks everyone for listening.
All right. You have a wonderful day.